The heads sat on the mantel like prized artworks. Only these weren't sculptures or busts. They were real, severed, preserved. Some still had traces of dried blood around their lips. Lips he had kissed. The most beautiful ones he kept for weeks. He would visit them alone in his private chambers, speaking to their decomposing faces, admiring the way death changed them. It sounds like the setup for a modern horror film. A twisted tale of serial murder and psychological decay. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. This was France in the 1430s. Inside the towering stone walls of a noble estate, one of the richest men in Europe, praised by kings and honored on battlefields, was collecting the heads of children with the same passion others reserved for art before the term serial killer even existed, before modern criminology or psychological profiling. The same terrifying patterns we associate with 20th century monsters were already present. The keeping of trophies, the gratification from killing, the selective targeting of beautiful victims, the ritualistic revisiting of corpses. But the most disturbing part, this killer wasn't a recluse. He was a national hero, a celebrated warlord and marshal of France. He had fought beside Joan of Arc. He commanded armies. He built churches. For nearly a decade, while poor children vanished around his castles, no one could lay a finger on him. Power protected him. Fame blinded those who might have questioned. And when Gilles de Rais finally stood on the scaffold in 1440, he wasn't just another criminal. He was the center of a mystery that still haunts historians today. To understand how a man could descend so far into darkness, we have to go back to where this nightmare began. Northwestern France, 1404, a boy is born into obscene wealth. His family controls so much land, they rival entire kingdoms. His name? Gilles de Rais. You might assume a boy born into such privilege would have a charmed life, but his world was built on blood, and it began spilling early. At just 11, Gilles likely witnessed the gruesome death of his father, mauled by a wild boar. Soon after, his mother died, leaving him an orphan. His fate fell to his grandfather, a man who would shape him into something both brilliant and monstrous. His grandfather didn't raise a Lille to be wise or compassionate. He raised him to be power-hungry and calculating. Later on trial for unspeakable crimes, Shiloh would blame it all on this man, on the way he was raised without discipline, allowed to indulge every cruel whim. B16, Gilles was already displaying a chilling duality. On the surface, it was gifted, fluent in Latin, charming, but underneath, he was volatile, prone to bursts of rage and violence. His rise was meteoric. B23, Gilles was serving under the future King Charles VII. At that time, France was in shambles, battered by the 100 Years' War. Then a teenage girl appeared, claiming divine visions. She said God had sent her to save France. Her name was Joan of Arc. Most nobles laughed. He was assigned to protect her in battle. Together, they became a legend. The siege of Orleans had dragged on for 6 brutal months. Then Joan and Gilles arrived. Within 4 days, the siege was shattered. A peasant girl and a young nobleman did what experienced generals couldn't. Town after town fell under their combined leadership. At just 25, Gilles was named Marshal of France, the highest military honor. But even as he was winning glory on the battlefield, something inside him was shifting. Medieval warfare was grotesque. Some historians believe this constant exposure to death awakened something already latent in Gilles. When Joan of Arc was captured in 1430, Gilles made no attempt to rescue her. Instead, he disappeared from public life, retired to his estates, a war hero, at the peak of his fame, gone. And what emerged in his place was something unrecognizable. Gilles began spending money with reckless abandon. He commissioned a grand play about the siege of Orleans, casting hundreds of actors. His household swelled to over 200 guards and servants. He commissioned art, music, money, but it was the chapel that raised eyebrows. In 1433, he built the Chapel of the Holy Innocents. Its choir boys were selected by Gilles himself for their voices and their beauty. The name was no accident. The Holy Innocents, a biblical reference to the children murdered by King Herod, a name that would take on a grotesque irony just a few years later. As his wealth dwindled, his grip on reality seemed to slip. And all the while, in the villages near his castles, children were beginning to disappear. It started with whispers, a few missing children here and there, mostly peasants. They'd gone to the castles of Gilles, begging for bread or offering to work, and were never seen again. At first, the disappearances were dismissed. It wasn't uncommon for poor children to vanish into servitude, but soon the pattern grew too disturbing to ignore. The stories all followed a similar script. A child was invited in, promised food or work, and then vanished. Villagers whispered among themselves, but who would dare accuse the Marshal of France? Eyewitnesses later claimed dozens of child corpses were hauled from one of Gilles's estates, but no one dared to act. His power was too vast. As his financial ruin deepened, Gilles turned from earthly pleasures to the occult. He brought in alchemists and mystics, desperate to restore his wealth. Among them was a young Italian cleric named Francesco Prelati, a man who claimed he could summon demonic spirits. The goal was simple: summon a demon named Baron, who, in exchange for sacrifices, would reveal hidden treasure. And the sacrifices required the hand, the heart, the eyes, and the blood of a child. Suddenly, the murders took on a new dimension, not just acts of cruelty, but of ritual. When Gilles finally confessed, the court was stunned by the calm way he described it. Children were lured in, treated with kindness, bathed, clothed, fed lavish meals. Then the game would begin. He would comfort them, assure them they were safe, and then he would string them up. He'd hang them by the neck until they passed out, revive them, and hang them again. Sometimes this went on for hours. Then came the killing, slitting throats, breaking necks, slowly sawing with a sword. He would dismember them, opening up their bellies to marvel at their organs. He would kiss their dead mouths. And when a child's face struck him as especially beautiful, he would sever the head and keep it displayed on his mantelpiece. When asked how many he had killed, Gilles answered simply, he'd lost count. The court charged him with 100 deaths. Some historians believe it was closer to 800 or more. But how did he escape justice for so long? The answer lies in the nature of medieval power. Gilles was nobility, protected, revered. Peasants had no voice. It took a single miscalculation for that wall of protection to crack. In 1440, Gilles got into a property dispute with a local priest. He stormed the church with armed men and abducted the priest mid. That act shattered any remaining protection. The Bishop of Nantes, who had long harbored suspicions, finally had the pretext he needed. But even then, they didn't arrest Gilles for murder. The official charges were heresy and church assault. In September 1440, soldiers surrounded his castle. Gilles, despite having hundreds of trained soldiers, simply walked out and surrendered. The game was over. What followed was one of the most chilling trials in medieval history. At first, Gilles was combative, mocking the judges, denying everything. In response, the church excommunicated him, stripping him of his rights. For noblemen, this was a fate worse than death. It meant eternal damnation. And that finally broke him. On October 15th, he appeared before the court a changed man. He agreed to confess. The threat of torture had unraveled him over several days. In graphic, articulate detail, he described the murders. He wept as he spoke, not from madness, but with the clear recollection of a man who knew exactly what he had done. He named his accomplices, loyal servants who aided him in the killings. They too were brought to court, and they too confessed. Their testimonies mirrored Gilles's in nearly every detail. The court was horrified but satisfied. And yet, even at the end, his noble birth granted him. He requested to make a final confession and be restored to the church. The request was granted. On October 26, 1440, thousands gathered to witness the execution. Gilles arrived dressed in white, the color of repentance. He spoke of forgiveness, blaming his own descent on the leniency of his upbringing. The crowd watched in grim stillness as the noose was placed around his neck. Gilles de Rais died, not with screams, but with silence. His body was quickly cut down and placed on a pyre, but the flames were stopped before they could consume him. His remains were taken to a church for burial. His servants were not so fortunate. Their corpses were left in the fire until nothing remained but ash. It could have ended there. But the story of Gilles de Rais wasn't finished, because in the centuries to come, historians would ask a far more uncomfortable question. What if the confessions were lies? What if the accusations were crafted not to punish evil, but to seize power? On one side are the skeptics. They point to the lack of physical evidence. No bodies were ever found. Only confessions extracted under threat of torture, and Gilles had plenty of enemies. The Duke of Brittany, who orchestrated the prosecution, conveniently inherited all of Gilles's lands. In 1992, a group of French legal experts held a symbolic retrial. The verdict: not guilty. They ruled the evidence was insufficient. But the defenders of his guilt have their own powerful arguments. The matching details in multiple confessions. The witnesses who claimed to see corpses removed. Could all of that have been fabricated? Could hundreds of families invent the same nightmare? The truth is, we will never know with certainty. The system that tried him was too corrupt to be trusted, but the evil described was too specific to be easily dismissed. Either way, the real terror isn't just whether Gilles de Rais was guilty. It's the fact that he could have been, that a man celebrated for bravery could also be remembered for butchery. And that's the legacy that truly haunts us. Was Gilles de Rais the first serial killer of modern history? Or the greatest scapegoat ever condemned by a corrupt court? You decide. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this twisted chapter of forgotten history gripped you, make sure you're subscribed, because this is only one of many tales your teachers never dared to tell. Until next time, stay curious.